Vote from MTech Consulting, and welcome to the February 15th ChicagoLand SharePoint Users Group session. Some interesting things that we're going to cover today. I'm excited. I've been working on this presentation since yesterday, and there's some stuff that's very timely that we're going to try to cover in today's session. Let's shift over here. Our agenda per every other standing session is to cover recent news from around the SharePoint ecosystem, to cover upcoming events, to talk a little bit always about big picture stuff and understanding SharePoint in the context of other anchor pillar technologies in your organization, and then we get to jump into cool new stuff. If time permits, we'll also do the BYOP, bring your own problem, and invite other people that are attending today's session to offer up problems that they're having into an open discussion and see if we can help push along and come up with some solutions, because hey, that's what a users group is supposed to do, whether it's virtual or whether it's physical. Excuse me. Recent news, not a ton of things going on. We still have feature pack 1 for SharePoint 26 is now available. There's some new and improved features for SharePoint Server 2016. There's a new Power BI web part available for Office 365. It's in preview mode, so it's only for the particular customers that have that preview access, that have signed up for that subscription. But that's exactly what I want to segue into for today's call. We're going to be talking about how to get Power BI into a web part as one of our primary topics. Looking around at events coming up, again, we mentioned in, excuse me, in last month's session that the winter time is always a little bit quiet. February, March, April, sorry, that should read April. Things are actually quiet. It's not going to be until April, May that we start to see other things going on. If other members attending today's session know of an event that they want to make everybody aware, please feel free to chat that in the chat window and share it with the rest of the group. Talking about big picture stuff, many of you who have been attendees for a couple of months now have seen this slide. SharePoint is an anchor technology, and we need to treat it like that. It's not about gaining adoption, it's about specifying the usage, which begs the question, where does SharePoint fit? In the world of different kinds of productivity tools, there are individual productivity tools like Outlook, Microsoft Office. There are group productivity tools, and that's where SharePoint actually comes in. It's all about people collaborating, and SharePoint is all about empowering people to collaborate. So you need to understand where your group processes are in your organization, and then you start to understand where SharePoint fits. Other big picture stuff is understanding why we're even looking at these power tools. Let me move a panel out of the way here momentarily. Microsoft has created all of these different power tools because it recognized that there's a trend of the users wildly outnumbering the developers in any and every organization. But the way to try to address that is not to turn all of the power users into your organization into full-on developers, but simply empower them to come up with business solutions that are up to the task of being businesses, while even though they may not be full tilt code coming from developers. By empowering that power user tier in your organization, this group of people, you end up tripling, quadrupling, significantly increasing the ratio of development type staff to the users, and the users end up getting their needs met with business solutions. That's Microsoft's vision for all of these power tools, whether it's SharePoint, whether it's Power BI, whether it's Power Apps, whether it's what should be called Power Flow. We want to keep that in mind, that why we're learning these tools, why they're in the context of SharePoint, is that they are just like SharePoint in the sense that they're a part of that power user empowerment to help develop business solutions without taxing the developers for pure code writing solutions. Going on to the next slide. Cool and new stuff. What we're going to try to talk about here today is SharePoint Power Apps, and more specifically Power BI in real life. For the last couple of weeks, we have been talking about Power Apps. We've seen some applications that I've gradually been building up to give people that have been attending our sessions an idea of what's possible inside various kinds of Power Apps. And we saw that you can create nice looking user interfaces on these mobile apps. that you're interacting with various kinds of SharePoint lists, and you even have the ability, excuse me, to interact with the GPS inside your phone, even inside Google, bring up Google Maps that are tied to different coordinates, things like that. It was all really cool stuff, and it represents the Power Apps side of integrating with Microsoft SharePoint. So you're using Power Apps to deliver mobile solutions that interact with SharePoint. There's a lot to like about Power Apps. There's a lot to be excited about that, including with Power BI. But there are some perplexing aspects about both of these tools. And one of the things we want to cover today is some of those tough lessons that if we teach them to you today, you'll avoid getting the scars tomorrow. Let's see what that looks like. So best practices that we've already arrived at for Power Apps, and some of you have seen this, that you need to use Power Apps Web Studio only for managing your applications. Do not try to build the applications inside the Web Studio. It will only lead to tears. You will lose data. You will lose entire applications if you lose any kind of connectivity. It's better to choose the Power Apps Windows Studio or the Desktop Studio for developing the apps. So manage by going into the Web Studio. As soon as you want to work on an app, open it up in the Windows Studio. Another good tip is to save your version as a part of the app name. What we've learned the hard way is that you can lose an entire application if you make some kind of a change that causes it to crash. You will lose that instance. Better that you're continually getting new save as versions of your mobile apps, of your Power Apps, so that if something does happen and it's catastrophic, you lose it, but you can go right back to the previous version, which is in the list of all of your different Power Apps. Another tip is to save new versions before you make changes. So in other words, when you're about to do something, save it to the slightly next version, make your changes. If it crashes, you simply go back to exactly what you used to have, and there's no harm done. Don't try to make changes and then save afterwards. Save the new version first, make the changes, see if they work. If they work, great, continue. Another one that I learned the hard way was watch your media sizes. Don't inadvertently build applications that have images inside them, splash screens, backgrounds that look attractive quite all right, but if you're carrying something that's a 6 meg file and suddenly it goes mobile and you're using a Wi-Fi connection to the internet, that 6 megs actually takes 40 times longer than the 150K version of that same file. Lesson learned, drop the file sizes on all of your images, all of your media, and you end up with a much more streamlined experience inside your Power Apps. Lastly, limit the number of data sources to each of your Power Apps to 1 list per app. You might be able to get away with 1 or even 2 lists per apps, but I think the whole point, the philosophy behind these Power Apps applications is you're trying to interact with a minimal number of data sources to perform very, very specific tasks inside and against a particular SharePoint list. So instead, build an army even, of Power Apps pointed at individual lists. Later on, you can build applications that might try to tie them together. But it's really, the Power Apps are all about convenient mobile interaction with those lists. A recent tip that I'll offer you is click on any alerts that appear. They're actually trying to help. They're little yellow flags that pop up inside your development environment, inside your studio. And when you click on them, they literally tell you where there's a problem in the code. It's the closest thing in Power Apps that you're ever going to have to actually being able to debug your code, and it's quite handy. The next thing I want to talk about for the remainder of today's session is talking about Power BI dashboards and reports. They're becoming more and more popular all through 2016. They got a lot of things ironed out in late 2016 that are making them very useful. What you really want to see, though, is the ability to get those Power BI dashboards and reports actually embedded inside SharePoint websites where they can actually be interacted with in a SharePoint context rather than just in a Power BI portal context or even in an email context. So what you see in these dashboards is the ability to gradually come up with more and more sophisticated dashboards, and what we're going to talk about today is how to get those inside SharePoint. In case you noticed, that actually was a secured Power BI report actually living inside SharePoint. This is what I consider to be the holy grail of using Power BI, is not just to get it into any generic website, but to get it in a secured manner, and that website should actually be a SharePoint website. This is what all of our customers are asking for. They're building websites that have lists. The lists have info path forms to allow, and mobile and Power Apps to provide them with either mobile access into populating those lists or a semi-intelligent, well-organized user interface if they're using a browser to interact with those lists. But ultimately, once they capture information in those lists, they want to be able to process that into intelligent decision-making tools, in other words, dashboards and reports. And they want those reports to be inside that SharePoint website as application. So in the next few slides, we will cover all of the different options that are currently available for how to actually do this, and we'll tell you what we think our own best pick is. Before we do that, I felt compelled that we need to talk a little bit about nomenclature for Power BI. The big warning at the top of the screen here is that you're going to hear a lot of lingo in Power BI thrown around incorrectly everywhere and anywhere. You're going to see it in YouTube videos, etc. You're going to see people simply using the wrong term the wrong way, and they act like it's no big deal. So in this slide, what I'm trying to do is actually clarify everything for people that are relatively new to Power BI and are questioning what all the terms mean and how they all fit together. Let's start with the first one, Studio. The term Studio is used to describe the two applications for building and viewing all of the models, all of the tiles, all of the reports, all of the dashboards that are actually used in Power BI. There are currently two versions of Studios, two instances. There's the Power BI Desktop Studio. It's an actual desktop application, aka a Windows application. It's got more features typically, and it's used to build only reports. We'll look at what those mean later. You're not going to have workspaces. You're not going to have things called dashboards. It's important to note, though, that currently only the Power BI Desktop Studio can actually import and work with SharePoint Online lists, which I find baffling, that the web version of the Studio is not able at this time to interact with those lists, but the desktop version is. That said, the Power BI Web Studio is a browser-based application. You browse into it. It's actually a very feature-filled studio. It allows you to build and view both dashboards and reports. The only thing is that you don't build the reports from the reports node that shows up there. In fact, you actually build them from the dataset node that actually displays. It's kind of quirky. The other thing that's missing is that you cannot actually access SharePoint lists. Ultimately, you end up with this point. You'll end up using both of these studios constantly. Most likely, when you're interacting and building reports that have to do with SharePoint lists, you'll exclusively be using the Desktop Studio. Then you'll be saving your report as a PBIX file, publishing it up into the portal, and interacting with it from there. So that gives us an idea of what the Studio is all about. It's the major tool used to actually create the various constructs in Power BI, the models, the tiles, the reports, the dashboard. The next thing you have to be wondering then is, what's a workspace? A workspace is a construct that exists only in the Web Studio. It's a secured container of dashboards and reports. So workspaces are a way of grouping dashboards, reports, and data sets in containers that you can then secure. You can share with different subsets, different subgroups inside your organization. That's all that they are. Everybody gets an individual workspace, and then it's up to you to define any group workspaces that you have. Inside that workspace then, if it's an individual or a group workspace, you're going to find dashboards, reports, and data sources. The dashboard, also available in the Web Studio, is simply an assembly of different tiles, different visualizations from multiple reports. This is a key concept. It's the dashboard that actually cherry picks individual pieces of multiple reports. So what's a report? A report is an assembly of tiles derived from a single data source or data set. And there's the distinction. A report ties into a single data set and then has a bunch of tiles on it, tables, visualizations. A dashboard can go and actually grab or pin tiles from multiple reports. So if multiple reports are all each tied into individual data sources, where a data source is a table, a spreadsheet, a log file, streaming data, you name it, then what a dashboard represents is a hodgepodge. It ends up being an aggregate or a mashup of multiple tiles from multiple reports, each from individual data sources. So that gives you an idea that what you're actually building most of the time are reports. You can build a report in the Web Studio or in the Desktop Studio. But once you have these reports made up of tiles tied into data sources, you would go back in and start building dashboards that are actually composites of the multiple reports. And the dashboards can only be built in the Web Studio. You're going to do that by going into individual reports and pinning all of the tiles that you want into different dashboards that you've defined, and then the dashboard just becomes this container of different tiles. I should pause for a moment and see if there's any questions. Back up for a moment. Are there any questions that anybody has so far about the difference between a dashboard, a report, a tile, and a studio? Any questions? I'm checking really quick here just to see. I don't think I see any, although I'm very pleased to see that we've got 11 attendees here, so it must be an apropos topic. Let me continue. Let's jump to the next slide. If I were to try to draw visually what's going on inside Power BI, you end up with four major kinds of constructs. You end up with workspaces, dashboards, reports, and data sources. If we talk about data sources first and work from the right to the left of this slide, we see that data sources represent spreadsheets, SharePoint lists, log files, even streaming data. Those data sources feed individual reports that you're building either in the Web Studio or the Desktop Studio. A report is multiple pages of tables and visualizations that are drawn each from individual data sources. So you end up with a lot of different reports. They're all stored initially locally in your desktop version, or they're stored as web reports up in the Web Studio. But ultimately, you end up assembling dashboards by drawing in any one dashboard from multiple visualizations in multiple reports, and then you store those dashboards in individual workspaces that end up giving you the control security-wise over who gets to see what. There's kind of the big Power BI ecosystem done completely and accurately, showing you guys where data sources feed into reports, feed into dashboards, feed into workspaces. What I hope is clearly illustrated here is that a dashboard is different from a report. A report is one set of visualizations tied to one data source, and a dashboard actually cherry picks from multiple reports. So it's a way of building a truly composite dashboard, if you will, application that ends up being the work of a lot of different people from a lot of different reports and a lot of different data sources. You'll see out on YouTube, people are going to interchange these. They'll tell you that they're building dashboards when in fact what they ended up building was a report. I wanted to clarify that. Let's go to the next slide. Some best practices that we picked up while using Power BI for the last few months with SharePoint then is that use the Power BI Desktop Studio to create the reports. It's the only studio that can actually import SharePoint lists. So you may as well get used to having it, always being it there. You get to store the PBX files that you've created as local files anyways, and that too has its use. Another tip is to start by clearly stating the questions that you want answered. What I mean by that is don't let the data determine the model. Instead, let the questions determine what it is that you're going to model. And you'll find out that you end up with a much more streamlined process of building, bringing in the right data sets, bringing in and tying those data sets together to create your model, and ultimately creating the larger tables that you're going to use to answer the questions you're trying to answer. So start with the questions in mind. You'll find out that that's becoming a more and more common practice, whether you're dealing with relational databases or whether you're dealing with columnar, scalable, distributed databases like you see in Hadoop and various kinds of MapR, MapReduce type of environments. It's kind of the wave of the future for larger data. Start with the questions. Work backwards to relate the data. Once you're done relating all the data, you're going to publish finished reports up into the cloud. From those reports, you're going to build dashboards from entire reports if you want, or from individual visualizations inside those reports. And once you're done, then you're going to embed only the secured, authenticated dashboards and reports into your SharePoint pages. And that's what we're going to cover shortly. There are a number of ways that people have developed for embedding Power BI objects, constructs into SharePoint. I've broken them up into what I call them the right ways and the wrong ways. Forgive the spelling error up there. The first wrong way is the thing called the iframe and the public URL. Ultimately, it's the only out-of-the-box method, which I find weird. It forces visualization to be completely public, meaning the data that you just made, the first thing you have to do is publish it anonymously, and then you're going to go and embed it basically in a content editor web part or in an iframe inside your SharePoint site. But in my own opinion, the damage is done. You've just exposed what is most likely confidential information out on the internet. I don't even know why this exists as an option. The vast majority of the use cases that you're ever going to see deal with confidential data, so this is kind of out. And feel free, if there are people that have comments, questions as we go, feel free to toss all of those out. I'm looking really quick to see if we've got any. So far so good, so I'm going to continue. Another way that's new and exciting, but it has its little pitfalls, literally came out last week on February 9th. Microsoft's new Power BI web part. What it actually does is allow you to go into a SharePoint page in the modern view. And when you go to add a web part, there's a new tool here that literally is called the Power BI web part. When you add that onto your page, you're going to go and bring up the web part properties. The only property it asks for is a URL to your Power BI object. You're going to get that URL by going into the Power BI Web Studio, going into your report, going into your object, and actually going and getting the URL from a drop-down menu that's currently available. Once you get that URL, you pop it in as the only property for that web part, and voila, after a few seconds of authenticating, that web part actually displays, and you end up with what looks like a pretty slick web part. Basically, add, configure, enjoy, but it comes at a price. Let's take a look. Upon closer look, we've divided up, we've arrived at some pros and cons for this new Power BI web part. The pros are, it's new, it literally just shipped in February 2017, last week. It's elegant, it's actually similar to a content editor web part. It's the way you would hope and expect it to work. It's simple, you add it to the page, you configure it, you're done. It should be that simple. Some of the cons, though, are that it's still in preview mode, meaning use at own risk. The users need to be subscribed to Office 365's first release. That's what I call the preview mode. But you should read it as you're a preview guinea pig. You have to be in that first release program. It's a little bit complicated, but then basically everything that has to do with authentication is at least a bit complicated, so we can't judge them there. Another con is that you have to publish the report to the Power BI portal. You assign that report to a group, and then you control that group. But again, that's the same that everybody has to do. You have to share this as a dashboard. You control access to that dashboard. And lastly, the last con is that you need a Power BI Pro subscription for every person that's actually going to consume this as a web part, which means this is not free. The Power BI Pro subscription, I believe, is $10 per person per month added on to whatever your organization is already paying for the entire SharePoint subscription, which is probably close to $15 per person per month. What that means is, realistically, in order to use this web part, you're effectively doubling the cost per month of every single person that wants to use this one piece of functionality on top of what they're already using in all of the rest of Office 365 combined. I think that's going to have to change. But there's still things to like. We're still watching for this particular web part. We'll have to see. We've heard some reports that there's some support issues, things like this. But at least it's worthy of being looked at since it just came out, and it is from Microsoft. Another possible right way is that in Microsoft's App Store is something called a Power BI app part. It's a subscription-based tool. It comes in at $2.99 a month. I interpret that to be $2.99 a month per person using it per month. It looks, again, quite nice. You add it, you configure it, you enjoy it in theory, but also at a price. Breaking up into the pros and the cons for this one, what we see is that it seems to be just what people are seeking. Give me a super simple web part that acts just like a content editor. I give it a URL and I'm done. You add it onto the page, you configure it, you enjoy it, and it's rocking. The cons, though, is that it's also not free. They want $2.99 per month, again, per person, and I'm not sure if this is a site license or not. I personally have to be a little bit skeptical. I can't help it. Whenever I see reviews that show very detailed negative ones, I take those to be very, very credible. When I see a review that comes in and says, great app, and that's it, and then I see numerous great apps, that's the only thing they do, they don't go into any detail whatsoever, I can't help but be a little skeptical that somebody seeded those in order to try to get a higher star rating. I'll go with the negative right now. This one doesn't seem to be quite ready for prime time, but for $2.99 a month per person, it may in fact represent a very real solution to embedding Power BI objects into SharePoint pages. So the jury's still out with me. I'm not ready to write them off yet. The last one, the one that I want to talk about a lot today, is this: creating a content editor web part, leveraging Azure and ADAL, Active Directory Authentication Library, JavaScript, to actually embed a report. This is someone else's development. It's literally the work over the last 6 months of at least 5 people. If you follow the trail on this article down at nearbaseline.com, you'll see a guy named Martin that actually came up with the final version that we think is very usable and worthy of talking about, worthy of sharing in a users group session like today. I'm going to try to distill it all down, but you're welcome to look at this link that we'll share in the slide presentation later to follow through all of the steps. If I were to condense it, what happens is this: you need to define your website, your entire intranet, as an application in Azure Active Directory. That means you're simply going to browse into dev.powerbi.com/apps. You're going to complete an online form to register a new AD app. So you're defining it, you're not developing it. You're just defining it and making it a known quantity to Active Directory, to your Azure Active Directory. And everybody's Office 365 subscription has a replica, an Azure-based replica of your Active Directory. So this is available. This is a zero cost to everybody. What you end up getting when you're done is that you receive an auto-generated client GUID and it's something called a client secret. The client GUID is what we actually really want, because that identifies the application later in the code that we're going to write. The next thing you'll want to do is modify an application definition to include implicit flow. You're going to browse into portal.azure.com. You're going to navigate to the Azure Active Directory node. You're going to click on app registrations. You're going to see the application that you just developed. You're going to click on the settings. You're going to edit the settings. The particular one's called the manifest. Inside the manifest file, which is just a JSON file that shows up inside your browser, you're going to look for one line that shows up on line 15 where it states OAuth to allow implicit flow false, and you're going to simply set it to true. No big deal. You save the manifest file, and all you've done then is announce or declare to your Azure Active Directory server that your website, your intranet, your SharePoint environment is now going to be acting like a client, and it's going to be trying to access and make different calls where it's going to want to invoke OAuth authentication, so OAuth 2.0. Once that's done, you go back into your report in Power BI. You publish your report into the portal. You create a content pack which includes this report and this data set. You create a shared version of this report in a common, what that creates is a common shared version of this report that goes into what's called the content pack library. Each person that wants to consume this then is going to end up re-importing this shared instance of the report into their My Workspaces, and that means now that they have access. They've finished making that connection, and now it's actually available for them to consume as a web part inside a browser. It's a sad little note that each person consuming the report needs to do this in their Power BI Studio, but the reality is this: we're not creating a snapshot or an image of this report. We're creating an actual interactive Power BI object that's embedded in a SharePoint page. When you click on it, it's actually doing things, which means SharePoint needs to know that you actually have the privileges of interacting with this web part and the Power BI object that's inside there. And the only way that gets accomplished is in the Power BI portal. So it's a necessary evil that everybody that wants access to this report in SharePoint has to do so by configuring their account in Power BI to make sure that they have access to that report through the portal itself. That sounds a little clunky. Let's continue and walk through this. Once you've done that, you're going to end up having access to a GUID that shows up in the URL for that shared web part. You're going to go back in and using this article, the near baseline that's down here, you're going to create a Power BI web part.html file. You're going to edit 4 entries in there that describe the client GUID, the report GUID, one other security related setting that you could leave at a default, and on line 86 is just really a piece of HTML, the iframe tag that decides what size it is, 600 by 800 pixels, something like that. So actually really quite straightforward. You're going to save that file. You're going to upload that file to the site assets library of your website where you're going to put this content editor web part. You're then going to add a content editor web part onto that web page where you want this Power BI object to show up, and you're simply going to reference the above HTML file in the CEWP, the content editor web part properties, and voila, the application, that Power BI object will actually show up. Let's momentarily jump out of my slide presentation and go into what this actually looks like in real life. Here is my Power BI demo dashboard. If I were to go looking for that particular report that I want to make available, what I ended up doing is sharing this as a content pack, bringing it back around inside my workspace in the shared version, so that if I look up inside here, I will end up seeing a GUID that represents a unique identifier for that particular report. Then if I go into the Power BI, if I go into a SharePoint page and add a content editor web part, all I really end up doing is editing this content editor web part to point at a single HTML file. That HTML file is actually this demo Power BI web part.htm. So if we go actually look at what that file looks like really quick. Dun, 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 dun. If I go into the Site Assets Library, and let me quickly download this to the desktop of this particular machine, and then open it up in Notepad. Oh, good, we got Notepad++ on here. Here's what we see. We see a pre-canned piece of JavaScript, and all the JavaScript really does inside here is capture a subscription ID. No big deal there. What's really important is that it's actually creating a configuration object inside JavaScript. That configuration object allows you to create an authenticated programmatic context or a programmatic session into SharePoint. You're providing a subscription ID, a client ID, a URL to the resource, report UID, and an OData filter. All the details that you normally would need in order to be able to create this authenticated session. Once you've created that config file, that little data object, you're actually going to, on line 28, create this authentication context. This is what really establishes a programmatic authenticated session. And once you have that authenticated session, the only thing that's actually done here is that this little mini micro client done in JavaScript, all it really does is go in and say, hey, there was an iframe on the page, please go and reload it, but pass in the security token that now is a part of this authenticated session. And the result is that when this web part loads, instead of it being an unauthenticated device, an unauthenticated object here, what's actually happening is the JavaScript underneath here is acting like a little micro client. It makes an authenticated connection session into SharePoint and into Power BI. It uses the same credentials. Then it goes and reloads the iframe that points at the URL that includes the GUID of this particular web part, so that what I'm looking at is not an image of this report, and it's not an anonymous actual Power BI object. It's an authenticated, secured Power BI object, and it's actually dynamic. When I interact with this, I can actually use the slicers and dicers that are inside here, and it's using the security credentials of Mark Vogt logged in to say Mark Vogt has the ability to interact with this particular web part. So you really do end up with the best of all possible worlds. You end up with Power BI functionality embedded into SharePoint for free, no cost here, but it's also secured and it's still dynamic. You have access to all of that functionality inside here. Let's jump back into the PowerPoint slides presentation and go over one more time how we arrived at this. Move this little screen. Sorry, screen. What's going on inside that magical HTML file then is a reference for the added jQuery. It's a reference to the ADAL for those of you that haven't used it. The Active Directory Authentication Library is that set of objects, that classes and functions, methods that are available in JavaScript to actually create these little authenticated programmatic sessions that allow us to make requests like an authenticated request for an iframe to deliver that report in a secure fashion. Very cool. You end up with an authenticated related configuration object that's created and populated. You end up with an auth context object. That's the programmatic authenticated session object. It generates the token, the backstage pass that's needed to go and make requests that are authenticated instead of unauthenticated. Once you have that security token, then you simply, the rest of this code asks for the iframe one more time, this time with the security token, and now the iframe actually renders all of that content in a secure fashion. If we were to analyze all of this then, this particular one, we would say that on the pro side of this approach, one, it's free. Enough said. Two, it is elegant. It's basically a content editor web part that's going and accessing an HTML file that contains some JavaScript where the only thing you had to change were 4 lines of code in what seems to be a fairly intuitive way. Even if you step through it the very first time, you're probably going to get it right. It's open even to free Power BI subscriptions is the last big pro. You don't have to have a pro account. So on the positive side, there's a lot to like there. On the con side, it's at least a little complicated the first time around. But anytime you're dealing with OAuth for the very first time and making authenticated requests, it's always going to be a little bit complicated. What we hope is that access to this highly documented, highly commented file is going to step you through it. And kudos to Martin, and there's one other person that actually came up with the original code that even he built off of. And then there's 3 other people that person built off of too. So, let me, there, sorry I was moving around there. So we've covered 4 major ways that people are trying to embed Power BI into SharePoint. Let's open up and see if there are any questions that we can answer. I'm not seeing anything in the polls or in the questions or in the chat.
Mark?
Yeah, question.
Hi, Mark. There does look like there are some questions. I know somebody had asked, does this work with Office 365 and on-prem?
Office 365, yes. On-prem, I'm not sure if, I want to say yes, that it could and should work with even on-prem, because ultimately, ask yourself what this is. It's a content editor web part. That works with on-prem. What's in the content editor web part is HTML and JavaScript. That too should work with on-premises. So the only thing that you have to worry about is that a lot of your Power BI is up in the cloud. So your on-premise environment has to have some kind of a trusted connection into the cloud as well. So if you've created any kind of a extranet access for your on-premise environment, then I would expect that you've met that connectivity requirement, that you've tied the Power BI up in the cloud through the extranet access into your on-premise SharePoint environment. But whoever actually asked that question, feel free to email me and let's continue exploring that. That would be a great thing to confirm with the group. But at this point in time, I have every reason to believe that this solution can work with an on-premise SharePoint environment. Are there other questions? Because I'm actually seeing it's blank again, Elizabeth.
It looks like there's, yeah, there was one through the chat window asking, and this was earlier, can this be scripted, you know, PowerShell, behind the scenes, and so forth? Oh, let's think. It's a HTML file that has to go in and be able to edit 4 different values. I would think that you might not want to script it, but you may be able to write a slightly more intelligent content editor web part where you expose those 4 lines of code as properties that you copy and paste values from your Power BI portal, the GUID, the client ID, stuff like that. You simply paste them in as web part properties that are part of a slightly smarter content editor web part, and then you would end up with a much more elegant solution than
manually editing an individual HTML file for each instance of the content editor web part. But that's another great suggestion. And now I'm looking at the chat to see what other questions are here. What with the cable guy? Show up adding the web part and connecting SharePoint. Are we still on the slides? Can it be scripted? I think we've answered that one now. We covered the scripted, hybrid, then use the device. You definitely have it. Use Delve. Oh, yeah. Yammer, I'm not sure about, someone else commented about embedding this inside Yammer. Am I interpreting that correctly? Nope.
Okay, let me see if he is able to be unmuted right now. Ralph, I'm going to unmute you. You're able to chat?
I'm open to trying to unmute everybody that's in attendance.
You are unmuted. Okay, so what I'm saying is Delve, Yammer, if you have any of those tools, clearly you have to have your AD, let's just say you have to have your whatever it is you're using to connect to your SharePoint, even locally, on AD. And in AD as in Azure AD, or at least known to Microsoft. Otherwise, there's no link. So folks that are pure on-prem, that have never done Yammer, or never done Delve, never done any of those nice little tools, will just simply not have it. They would have to go to whatever rigmarole to get it. But of course, Microsoft is making it such that, you know what, we're going to make it painful for you to stay off.
Who's asking the question right now? Who have we got on the call?
So this is Ralph talking right now.
Oh, hey, Ralph. Hey.
Hey there. So I was just saying that, like, just why I wanted to know if it was on-prem, and I understand the concept. It's like basically, in order to use Azure AD, you have to have some way to Azure to recognize you somehow. And if you're already doing Yammer or Delve or any one of those little tools, not little tools, but Office 365-ish stuff, that's not on-prem, you have it. You know, it's already set up for you. So basically, have at it. But if you don't, then it's a rigmarole to set up.
Yeah, it can be quite a hassle. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, Ralph. Microsoft's push is into the cloud, everybody.
Right.
2016 was actually the year of the hybrid environment. Yes. You could think of 2017 as the year where Microsoft doesn't look backwards. So you guys got to get on board and get off of your on-premise environment and up into the cloud. And there's all kinds of reasons to want to do that. I mean, there's hardly a downside to moving SharePoint up into the cloud versus remaining on-premise. And it's just going to get worse in 2017 and worse in 2018.
Well, in essence, the key over there is, like, if you pay for 2016 and you don't use any of the cloud features, you're essentially buying your Jag without, you know, nice wheels, with like ugly seats, you know, with essentially a beautiful-looking car that the moment you look closely is basically a Lego car, right?
Yeah,
and
no motor.
No motor. Well, there's a motor, but it's a Lego motor. So, you know, that's what you want, that's what you get. And let's just say, folks that are worried about the security aspect, I will tell you right now, I'll give you Target and all those bigger companies that have supposedly millions and millions in infrastructure, and they were slammed and killed. But I don't know of anyone who's been slammed and killed being on AWS, on Azure, or any of those services to date.
I'd have to agree with that. Hey, what else? We've got 9 people on the call today. Who else has had a problem where they're trying to get Power BI embedded into SharePoint? And I know that this entire session kind of got hijacked and steered that way. But as I was preparing this presentation yesterday and looking at all the Power App stuff and then delving into the Power BI, it really started to hit me just how important this particular topic was. Getting Power BI objects embedded inside SharePoint pages, which is why this entire session kind of ended up focusing on that area and showing you all the different efforts that all the different organizations have been putting in to try to accomplish this in an elegant manner. Let's hear from some of the other people. Any other people that have tried embedding Power BI, tried a different way, and have any insights, any scars, any tips, any tricks to share? Let's open up the lines. Is that possible to open up all the lines, Elizabeth? Hey, quiet.
Folks will mute themselves back if they're you know.
Come on, I see Michael Blumenthal on. There's one other plus that I don't know. Elizabeth, can people still hear me?
Yes, and everybody is unmuted.
Fantastic. There's another plus side to the way that we're suggesting and recommended this JavaScript HTML content editor one, is that if you go in and actually study the JavaScript code that's being used there, what you are seeing is actually the nucleus of a very reusable solution for embedding any kind of functionality inside SharePoint pages. In other words, that JavaScript is almost like the Rosetta Stone of how to actually build micro JavaScript clients that allow you to embed secure content inside SharePoint from other sources. It's a great primer, in other words. Michael, what have you seen out in the field, out in the wild, as far as people trying to get Power BI into SharePoint?
So I've actually done very little with Power BI, so I don't have an answer to that. But when you're talking about the way that things are embedded and using ADAL and getting the tokens, is that essentially the SharePoint framework in action then, or is that a precursor to the SharePoint framework?
Precursor to the SharePoint framework. In fact, that's probably going to be next month's topic, is an overview of the new SharePoint framework. But what you are seeing is still something, it's not old. ADAL is brand new for Microsoft. It's a way of, it's kind of staying in the older context of SharePoint, but tackling authentication with the newest tools available from SharePoint, most specifically with the ADAL, the Active Directory Authentication Library, the JS version, the .js library. That is going to become everybody's go-to tool for being able to integrate secure components, secure content, secure functionality inside SharePoint sites. Since we got everybody on the phone and the connection seems really good, let's talk for a minute about what we want to cover in next month's session. I would love to cover the SharePoint framework. Does everybody else think that that's actually a good idea?
Sure.
Yes.
Clearly the direction Microsoft is heading in for custom development on SharePoint Online.
Yep. And we could literally consume an entire call, an entire user group session on it, and I think it would be very timely.
That'll be several months of user sessions right there alone. As a note, if anyone here is not participating with the Patterns and Practices group, Vesa Juvonen and company, Patrick Rogers, all the so-called big names on the Microsoft side, they have a bi-weekly, well, actually it's monthly, but because they're doing 2 of them a month, it's practically a bi-weekly meeting where they discuss a lot of these bits, but they go into detail. There's it's a big community now. So I think it's, gosh, I don't have the link handy. It's the Patterns and Practices. You should be able to look it up. Somebody will post it before I'm done over here. Ralph, feel free to post up on the Meetup site so that we're collaborating more and more through the Meetup site. Please. Sure. So yeah, so that one's sort of like, if you're doing on the programming side, that is a must-have. At the very least, folks that are doing planning or doing administration, you should be aware of it. So before you go crazy on your PowerShell, before you go stuff, look what's there first, because there's stuff there, that's actually makes almost like a lot of what we're doing almost obsolete. The client-side stuff, like there's like a PowerShell that says add JS block. So I'm already looking at this, and I see a content-edited web part, but I also see add JS block. So now we can add those property bags and all those other bits, via PowerShell. Straight up, and then your little HTML, if you have them in the so-called content editor web part, will be very, very tiny, and they won't reveal squat because the user can open them, and they'll just see over there. It's not only obfuscated, it's referencing tokens of stuff, and they have no idea where they're coming from. And even if they try to put Fiddler on there, they'll still not know what the heck they're looking at.
Very good to know, Ralph. Thanks for the good feedback on that. I'm also seeing Dan on the call, Kartik, Matthew, in addition to others. One thing that's been driving me crazy is that since we started down the Power Apps and Power BI tracks for the last few sessions, I've heard from a couple people saying they've been working and they might even be curious or interested in demonstrating some of their work. Dan, Kartik, Matthew, anybody out there that's been working on some Power Apps that they actually would like to share with the group. You guys have seen some of the stuff that I've been doing. Who cares about what Mark does? I want to see what everybody else is doing too.
I've been playing with some trivial uses of Flow. This is Michael. If I can go back to add on something to what Ralph was saying about
the patterns and practices content out there on GitHub,
Sure.
is that you want to be careful to make sure that you're using if you're following example from GitHub or using sample code from GitHub, you want to try to validate that it's the that it's the latest and greatest stuff. Because when I was out there a few months ago, there were so many examples out there, and they haven't been tightly curating that content, and so I ended up starting to look at examples of that were methodologies that had gotten away from. So when you're getting something from GitHub or following examples in GitHub, look at the publication date, and if you have any doubt if that's the recommended way to do things, then go over to techcommunity.microsoft.com and ask questions about it there. When I did that with some sample code I was looking at, people from Microsoft told me, "Oh no, don't look at that example anymore. That's old. We're doing this other thing over here." But because there's just so much stuff out there, they've had a hard time curating it tightly.
Yeah, I hear you. And a good tip, Mike. I appreciate that.
And what
else is on everybody's mind? This is actually been a great connection. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, this is Matt. I just wanted to compliment you guys. I mean, we've been looking at Power BI and doing it in some smaller fashions for clients, but the licensing structure and everything for the last few years has kind of scared us away in the complication. But this was great, and we've also, just to piggyback on the scripting and everything, we're pretty good. I'm pretty close with Patrick, and he's been helping our team along, especially our new guys, in finding the right way to utilize those patterns and practices. I think that's a great reference, great resource. Okay, good.
Have you got anything that you want to show to people? Were you one of the ones that was saying 2 months ago that you had a Power Apps demo that you wanted to share with the group?
No, it wasn't our team. Nope. We're just getting into this type of BI here in SharePoint, so we haven't done anything adventurous. Maybe in 2 months, but
yeah. I can see two things that I want to try to tackle. For those of you that have also been working in Power Apps, those of you that have been working in Power BI, we just showed Power Apps interacting with SharePoint, Power Apps interacting with Google's static API and things like that in past lessons. That's great. Power Apps interacting with SharePoint, that's great. We showed Power BI interacting with SharePoint. What the killer app needs to be is going to be Power Apps with pages or screens in there that actually have Power BI functionality embedded in them. So now imagine that you got a Power Apps mobile app, and that mobile app is giving you this super slick, super elegant, super convenient access into the SharePoint lists that you're using to feed all of your content, and which ultimately is your data model. And then somewhere else on that very same Power Apps Power Apps application are screens that actually process all of that data and deliver some kind of dynamic reports, some kind of dynamic dashboards and visualizations that you can interact with in real time to actually to do something with the data that you're capturing. So your Power Apps ends up being a very powerful mobile app indeed. It's a way of interacting with the raw data, we'll call it, in the lists themselves, but it also gives you the payoff that somewhere else on that application you get to actually see truly useful visualizations, dashboards that allow you to make decisions based on the data that you're contributing and also the data that other people are contributing through that exact same Power App. Is there any interest in us trying to come up with something like that for the next session, where it's going to be not Power BI and not Power Apps in SharePoint or Power BI in SharePoint, but Power Apps and Power BI and SharePoint, the magic trio putting everything all together? Are there any thoughts, any interest in that area? Sure, Mark, that'd be great. No? Michael, what do you think? Matt, what do you think? Did I lose everybody again?
No,
no.
I think the one thing I think, did you include Flow in that list?
Yeah, we've tried rudimentary aspects of Flow inside those Power Apps too, because the Flow is actually operating on, say, a SharePoint list, kind of as a replacement to a list workflow in SharePoint Designer. But even we found out in several sessions earlier, Michael, that there are some limitations in flow and as far as which kinds of SharePoint lists it can actually interact with. It can interact only with custom lists, but it cannot interact with some of the canned lists, like a task list, like I think it can get into document library. There's some
that
known
was an
limitations.
old problem. Yeah, that was an old problem. They still haven't solved it. Really?
All right.
Man.
So so even Ralph, you sound like you're on the cutting edge. It's still the same problem with the flow. You can't get into anything except a custom list.
Custom list, right? It was like a biter. It was like, what was the point of that? Why a custom list? Okay,
I'm at a loss.
That's still a problem. All right.
I haven't even come up with a workaround yet, because everything that I can think of where you're maybe creating a workflow that tries to transfer contents into a custom list, and then your flow interacts with the custom list. Oh man, is that clunky
but then you
inelegant?
end up having to make an actual old school workflow to populate the list. Well, I think they're going to fix it though. They got to fix it.
I think you're recognizing the horrible irony even in my workaround. Yeah, you're using an old school SharePoint Designer list workflow to try to make up for a deficiency in the new replacement workflow that's supposed to replace SharePoint Designer's declarative workflows. Go figure. Yeah.
Done.
What else do we have to talk about? Did I miss anything in the last month? Is there any other news or events around the area that people want to talk about? Because sometimes I jump right into the area that's of interest to me, and that misses the point of the users group. Now I'm hearing everybody. What else is going on, guys, that you want to share with the group?
Well, at the user group meeting that I ran earlier this month, the two news items I pointed out were the arrival of the newest OneDrive for Business Sync client that will sync SharePoint libraries in Office 365, in addition to OneDrive for Business and OneDrive Personal, so you can have one sync client that syncs them all.
That is handy. I use Sync a lot. Go ahead.
So yeah, and the other news item then is that if anyone is still on MOS 2007, MOS 2007 end of life or end of support is this October.
I'm just making a note of that. I think that we had another one on 2010. Didn't 2010 get declared end of life even a few months ago? So that even 2007, I'm surprised 2007's official end of life is still coming up. I thought it was long dead.
Yeah, no, the official end of support is this October.
Okay.
There is you can go on to Microsoft.com somewhere and find the specific end of support dates for these things. With the release of 2016, then that sort of accelerates the milestones for all the previous versions.
Understood. Any other news and events? Any other events coming up that we need to know about in the area? Typically, I do a quick scan just before our sessions to look and see if there's conferences that are going on regionally. I think there's a SharePoint Saturday Twin Cities coming up in March. There was a call for papers, things like that, but I don't think there's anything closer to Chicago or even in the Detroit area yet. Is anyone else aware of any other local, more regional events that are SharePoint related? Mike, do you know if there's any SharePoint Saturday going on in the western suburbs coming up?
There will be. There will be. That is, I want to say, is that in May?
That'd be great. That'd be good timing.
It's usually in the spring.
Yeah.
For the one in the burbs.
Yeah, for the one in the burbs.
I keep a list of these things. I've got a list for 2017 Chicago IT events, and I'm just pulling that up now.
Yeah.
Let me.
While you're looking that up, Mike, I'm going to tell the rest of the team something else that's nice. When MTech inherited this users group back in October, we had 180 members. And as of this week, we're now at 206 and counting. We seem to be increasing our membership by somewhere between 2 and 5 people per week, where the organization's most users groups have actually been struggling over the last couple of years. So I think us shifting to this virtual format has actually turned out to be a very positive step, that it's increasing our membership. And what that also does is give us the ability to expand who we're including. It doesn't have to be just the ChicagoLand SharePoint users group, but you may see us actually change our name to the Tri-State SharePoint users group and try to expand, because what's the difference between somebody calling in from downtown Chicago or somebody calling in from Milwaukee? There's no difference, and the more the merrier. This users group benefits when people like Michael, when people like Ralph, when people like Matthew are all contributing in addition to me doing my little presentations. And adding to that team, hearing from people in, I don't know, Detroit or Indianapolis or Milwaukee, this would be fantastic contributions to the overall purpose of this meeting, which is to share knowledge, share expertise, share tips and tricks, and to ask for help. We've just overshot our 1 hour by 2 minutes. I feel obliged that we want to try to wrap up because we try to keep to only 1 hour. Any other final thoughts, any other final questions, comments, or even suggestions for the next session? All right, hope everybody found today's session useful. Hope you found some insights in some of the legwork that MTech has done to try to evaluate some of these existing Power BI topics. Next month, March 15th, is going to be an initial overview of the SharePoint framework, and alongside that is going to be our first stab at trying to merge Power Apps applications with SharePoint and with Power BI, and we'll tell you how we do with that. So the whole goal here is to try to, we're trying to make SharePoint mobile, and we're trying to make SharePoint deliver information. There's the integration with Power Apps, there's the integration with Power BI. That's the wave of the future. So framework plus that enhanced version of Power Apps. And if you guys have any other suggestions, the meetup site is there. Feel free to share that meetup site with other colleagues. Feel free to get more people involved and invested. The more interest we have, the more time I'm permitted to actually devote to actually preparing for the presentations, things like that. So it's all good. That's all I got. Thanks everybody for showing up and for staying. Nice to see the increased attendance and the increased participation via the phone. We'll talk to you guys on March 15th, okay?
Mark, thank you very much. Mark.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks guys. Bye-bye.
Multitask.